Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back into the hushed sacred heart of ancient Rome. Imagine the city quietening down around you, the cobblestone streets emptying, the familiar sounds of the marketplace fading into the distance. The only light, perhaps, comes from flickering oil lamps in windows, and maybe, just maybe, a distant, steady glow emanating from the very center of the Roman Forum, the eternal flame of Vesta, goddess of hearth and home. It's a fire that must never go out, a symbol of Rome's perpetuity, its safety, its destiny. And tonight, you're going to find out what it was really like to be one of the chosen few, one of the women tasked with keeping that flame alive. Trust me, after hearing about the stakes involved, your own job feels pretty chill in comparison. You probably wouldn't survive a Tuesday as a Vestal, honestly. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening live or just want to say hi, let me know where you are and what time it is for you right now. Always cool to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're young, maybe 6, 7, perhaps 8 years old. You live in Rome, a city bustling with noise and life and smells you've known your whole short existence. You have a family, a home, toys made of wood or clay, the simple pleasures of a Roman child. But one day, something changes. There's talk, hushed and serious amongst the adults. Eyes look at you differently. There are whispers of Vesta, of the sacred fire, of a calling. You don't fully grasp it yet. The weight of it, the sheer, terrifying importance. But you feel the shift in the air around you. It's like being picked for the school play. But instead of just remembering lines, the entire fate of the city might hinge on your performance. No pressure, right? The truth is, you're being considered for one of the most unique, powerful, and incredibly restrictive roles a woman could hold in Rome becoming a Vestal virgin. It wasn't a job application you filled out. There was no online portal or LinkedIn profile needed. For centuries, the method of selection was known as captio, literally meaning taking or seizing. It felt a bit like being drafted, though without the marching band and parade. The ultimate decision maker was the most important religious figure in Rome, the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest. Imagine the Pope, but with more political power and a really distinctive pointy hat. He had the authority to select new Vestals when a vacancy arose, which usually happened when an older Vestal retired after her 30 years of service. Or, tragically, if one died young, who was eligible? Not just anyone. There were specific criteria. You had to be of freeborn parents who were also freeborn, living and residing in Italy. No slaves in the immediate family tree, sorry. You also had to be physically sound, free from any significant defects or impediments. No limp, no stutter. Nothing that might be seen as an ill omen or make you unsuitable for sacred duties. Think of it as needing to pass a cosmic background check and a basic health screening administered by guys in togas. The age range was quite strict between 6 and 10 years old. This young age wasn't arbitrary. It meant you would spend your most formative years completely immersed in the ways of Vesta, learning her rights, her history, her demands, with little memory of any other life. It ensured your purity wasn't just theoretical, but ingrained from childhood. Historians still argue whether the Pontifex Maximus chose girls purely by nomination from suitable families, or if there was some form of lottery involved, at least in earlier periods. It's a bit murky, lost in the mists of ancient record-keeping, or lack thereof. Was it a divine sign guiding his hand, or just the most prominent guy picking from a list of eligible families he knew? We may never know for sure, but the result was the same: a young girl, suddenly plucked from her ordinary life. Imagine the scene. The Pontifex Maximus, perhaps surrounded by other priests, approaches your family home. There's formality, solemnity. You, a small child, are presented. He might perform a brief ceremony, perhaps touching your hand or hair, speaking words of dedication to Vesta. This single act, the captio, seals your fate. You are now capta, taken. You are no longer just your parents' daughter. You are a daughter of Vesta, bound to her service for the next 30 years. 30 years. As a kid, that probably felt like infinity, like waiting for Christmas morning times about 1,000. A mainstream historical fact is that the Vestal virgins served for a fixed term of 30 years. This service was divided into 3 10-year periods. The first 10 years were dedicated to learning the duties and rituals, the second 10 to performing them, and the final 10 to teaching the new recruits. It was a structured, lifelong commitment, starting before you even hit double digits. A quirky tidbit about the selection process is that, traditionally, the Pontifex Maximus was expected to take the girl from her father's hand. If her father wasn't alive, it would be taken from her grandfather, then her mother, then a brother, and so on, following a specific order of male relatives. It underscores the intensely patriarchal nature of Roman society, even when dealing with a female priesthood. It's like, okay, girl, you're dedicated to a goddess, but first we need a guy to sign off. Classic Rome. The process wasn't always smooth sailing. Families sometimes tried to avoid this calling for their daughters, perhaps reluctant to give up their child permanently, or perhaps fearing the immense responsibility and the terrible consequences of failure. Forcing a family to give up their daughter for state religious service feels pretty intense, like mandatory divine jury duty. But for life, the state, represented by the Pontifex Maximus, had the ultimate authority. However, and refusal was not a trivial matter. Your life as you knew it was over. The life ahead was one of immense privilege, but also profound isolation and absolute dedication. You were about to embark on a journey that few Romans truly understood, a path walked by only 6 women at any given time, chosen to be the keepers of Rome's most sacred flame. And as you leave your childhood home, clutching maybe one small toy or comfort item, the weight of that future begins to press down, heavy and undeniable. You are a Vestal virgin now. The heavy wooden door of your family home closes softly behind you, a sound that feels strangely final. You're holding the hand of the Pontifex Maximus or one of his attendants, and the familiar sounds of the city streets seem to recede as you walk towards the heart of Rome, towards the Forum. It's a short journey but feels immense, a passage from one world to another. You glance back, perhaps at the life you're leaving, the people who raised you, the corner where you played. That life is now a memory, a prologue to the story that is about to unfold within the sacred precinct of Vesta. You are entering the Atrium Vestae, the House of the Vestals, which will be your home for the next 3 decades. Remember that 30-year term we talked about. Yeah, it starts now. You step through the gate into a large, open courtyard, perhaps with a long pool or garden running down the middle. Statues line the sides, silent and imposing. The air feels different here, calmer, perhaps less chaotic than the city outside. The sounds are muted, replaced by the soft echo of footsteps on stone, the distant cooing of doves, maybe the gentle murmur of voices. This is a sanctuary, a place set apart from the mundane world, dedicated entirely to the service of a goddess. It's also, let's be honest, your new boarding school, convent, and workplace all rolled into one, with much stricter rules than your average Sunday school. Inside the Atrium Vestae, you are formally introduced to the other Vestals. There are usually 6 of them, the Virgo Maxima, the chief Vestal, who is the oldest and holds the highest authority, and 5 others of varying seniority. You, being the newest recruit, are instantly the most junior, the Tirocinium, the one who knows absolutely nothing and must learn everything. It's like being the absolute newbie on the first day of a very exclusive, very ancient job. Except everyone else has been there for years, maybe even decades. The hierarchy is clear and absolute. The Virgo Maxima isn't just your boss, she's your spiritual mother, your teacher, and the final authority on daily life and sacred duties. Her word is law within these walls. Your first 10 years as a Vestal are entirely dedicated to training. This isn't like learning a few prayers and how to light a candle. It is an intense, rigorous education in the ancient religious practices of Rome. You learn the prayers, the hymns, the intricate choreography of the rituals performed for Vesta and for the state. You memorize vast amounts of sacred text, the precise wording essential lest you accidentally offend a deity or mess up a crucial ceremony. Imagine having to learn Latin poetry by heart, but instead of getting a bad grade if you forget a line, you might risk divine displeasure upon the entire city. No cramming the night before permitted here. You are also taught the history of Vesta's cult, its origins, the significance of the sacred fire and the objects kept hidden within the temple. You learn about the various festivals throughout the year that involve the Vestals, understanding your specific role in each. There's practical instruction too, how to tend the fire correctly, how to perform the purification rituals, how to prepare the sacred foods used in ceremonies. It's a curriculum that blends theology, history, ritual practice, and domestic skills, all filtered through the lens of divine service. Historians still argue about the specifics of the Vestal curriculum, how much changed over time, and whether their education extended beyond religious matters into areas like law or administration. Given their later roles, it's one of those details that the ancient sources are frustratingly vague about. Life during these first 10 years is likely very regimented. Early mornings, communal meals, long hours spent studying and practicing. You would spend time observing the older Vestals performing their duties, shadowing them, gradually being given more responsibility as you learned the ropes. The environment would be one of strict discipline and constant supervision. You are never truly off duty from the expectations placed upon you. Your behavior, your thoughts, your very presence is meant to embody the purity and dedication required by Vesta. A quirky tidbit about their training is that they were taught a specific, archaic form of Latin for the religious rituals. This wasn't the everyday Latin spoken in the streets. It was an older, more formal language preserved only for sacred purposes. It's like learning Shakespearean English just to perform church services. Sounds fancy. Probably confusing. This archaic language added to the mystique and authority of the Vestals. They were literally speaking the language of the gods and ancient ancestors. During this learning period, you would still be very much a child or young teenager, but living under conditions far removed from typical Roman childhood. You would wear the distinctive Vestal attire, the simple white stola and the 6 knotted headdress senicrines, marking you out instantly as sacred. You wouldn't have the freedom to run and play in the streets with other children. Your companions are the other Vestals, women who have similarly been chosen for this path. You form bonds with them, a sisterhood forged in shared dedication and the unique pressures of your role. Think of it as the most intense, high-stakes sleepover imaginable, lasting for a decade. This training wasn't just about performing rituals, it was about internalizing the values of the cult: purity, discipline, devotion to Rome and its gods. You were being shaped into a living symbol of Roman virtue, a representative of the goddess herself on earth. And failure to embody that ideal, especially regarding your vow of chastity, carried consequences we'll discuss later that were frankly terrifying. But for now, as a young recruit, your focus is solely on learning, absorbing the ancient ways, preparing for the 2 decades of active service that lie ahead. You are a vessel being filled with sacred knowledge, preparing to tend the fire that keeps Rome safe. Your first decade is dedicated to learning. Right. You're memorizing prayers, practicing gestures, absorbing the centuries of tradition that make up the cult of Vesta. But all that learning, all that strict discipline, all the early mornings spent in the quiet sanctity of the Atrium Vestae, it all points towards one central, absolutely critical responsibility: tending the sacred fire. This isn't just any bonfire, this is the fire, the one housed in the small, round temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum, just steps from where you live. It is the heart of Rome, flickering, breathing, a physical manifestation of the goddess herself and, terrifyingly, of Rome's continued existence and prosperity. Imagine stepping into that temple, even as a young trainee observing. The air is warmer inside, carrying the faint, constant smell of wood smoke. In the center, on a raised hearth, is the fire. It might not be huge, but it burns steadily, intensely. Your job, the fundamental purpose of your life as a Vestal, is to ensure that flame never, ever goes out. Not for a minute, not for a second. This is a 24/7 gig, 365 days a year, for 30 years. No holidays, no sick days, definitely no hitting the snooze button. It's the ultimate perpetual motion machine, and you are the human component that keeps it going. The Romans believed truly and deeply that the safety and well-being of the state were tied to the sacred fire of Vesta. If the fire died, it was the worst possible omen, a sign that Vesta had abandoned Rome. That disaster was imminent. We're talking crop failure, military defeat, plague, the full catastrophe bingo card. So, keeping that fire alive wasn't just a religious duty, it was an act of national security. Think of it as guarding the launch codes, but way older and fueled by oak logs. The pressure was immense, a constant weight on your young shoulders. The practicalities of tending the fire involved a routine of adding fuel regularly. Sources suggest oak was the preferred wood, carefully selected and prepared. You would need to know exactly when and how much wood to add to keep the flame strong without letting it get out of control. It required constant vigilance. You couldn't just pile on a bunch of wood and hope for the best. It was a delicate balance, learned through observation and practice during those first 10 years. You'd use long bronze tongs, maybe some sort of rake or shovel to manage the ash. You learned to read the fire, understanding its moods, anticipating its needs. Since the fire had to burn day and night, the Vestals must have worked in shifts. Historians still argue about the exact details of their duty rotation. Was it a strict schedule, or did the older Vestals supervise the younger ones on a less formal basis? Did they take turns staying awake all night? It wasn't like they had smartwatches to remind them to feed the fire. It relied on their dedication and discipline. Imagine trying to stay awake all night, listening to the crackle of the fire, when you're just a kid who probably just wants to curl up and sleep. It must have been exhausting, demanding not just physical presence, but mental alertness. A quirky tidbit related to the fire is how they handled the ash. On specific days of the year, the ashes from the hearth were ritually cleaned out and carried to a designated spot, possibly the Tiber River or a specific sacred location. This wasn't just tidying up, it was a religious act, removing the sacred waste in a prescribed manner. You couldn't just sweep it into a dustpan and toss it in the nearest dumpster. Every aspect of the fire, from the wood that fueled it to the ash it produced, was sacred and required specific handling. Now, what happened if, despite all the vigilance, the unthinkable occurred and the fire went out? This was called ignis extinctus and was considered a major religious transgression, a sign of negligence so profound it threatened the entire state. The Vestal on duty who was responsible faced severe punishment, often a beating by the Pontifex Maximus himself. Then, the fire had to be relit, not with a simple torch or spark, but through a pure, ancient method, usually by rubbing two pieces of wood together to create friction. It was a process that underscored the gravity of the failure and the need for ritual purification before the sacred flame could be restored. A mainstream historical fact is that the continuous burning of the sacred fire was considered absolutely vital for the security and prosperity of Rome from its earliest legendary beginnings until the abolition of the Vestal cult in the late 4th century AD. This wasn't just a quaint tradition, it was a cornerstone of Roman state religion. For over 1,000 years, a handful of women carried the burden of ensuring that flame never faltered. So, your training period, those first 10 years, involves countless hours spent near that hearth, watching, learning, internalizing the rhythm of the fire. You feel its warmth, hear its whispers. Understand, with a child's deep intuition and a trainee's growing fear, the weight of the responsibility that will soon be yours alone to bear. Keeping that flame alive isn't just a duty, it's the very breath of Rome, held in your young hands. While keeping the sacred fire burning is the absolute non-negotiable core of your duty, the single task that would get you in the most immediate, terrifying trouble if you messed it up, your life as a Vestal Virgin is far from just sitting by a hearth all day. Think of the fire as the constant background hum of responsibility. The prayers and rituals are the scheduled events. The performances you must nail perfectly, beyond the perpetual vigilance over the flame. Your days are filled with a myriad of other sacred duties, connecting you deeply to the religious life of Rome. You rise early, the quiet of the Atrium Vestae still thick in the air. Your first duties likely involve morning prayers, perhaps within the small shrine dedicated to Vesta within the house itself, or maybe a visit to the temple just as the first rays of sun hit the forum. These aren't casual whispered requests, they are formal, often ancient prayers, perhaps spoken in that archaic Latin you're still learning. You offer small sacrifices, maybe grains, fruit, or a libation of milk to the goddess, giving thanks and asking for her continued favor on Rome. It's a structured start to the day, setting a tone of reverence and dedication before the city outside fully wakes up. Throughout the day, and certainly throughout the year, your schedule is punctuated by numerous specific rituals. The Roman religious calendar is packed, and the Vestals, as priestesses of a state cult, have roles in many ceremonies beyond those exclusively dedicated to Vesta. You might participate in purification rites, perhaps cleaning parts of the temple or the house with sacred water. You might be involved in preparing specific offerings for other deities, acting as intermediaries or ensuring the ritual purity of the materials used. It feels like being part of a divine administrative team, constantly processing paperwork and ensuring all the cosmic boxes are ticked. Precision is paramount in Roman religion. It wasn't enough to have good intentions. The prayers had to be recited word for word correctly. The rituals performed with the exact, prescribed movements and gestures. Get a single syllable wrong, drop a sacred item, perform a step out of sequence, and the whole ritual could be invalidated, requiring it to be repeated. This is why your training is so demanding. You have to know these complex procedures backwards and forwards. Imagine the stress of having to perform a public ritual flawlessly, knowing that a single mistake isn't just embarrassing, but potentially vitium, a religious flaw that could bring bad luck. It's like performing brain surgery. But for the soul of the city, a mainstream historical fact is that the Vestal Virgins were central figures in several major state religious festivals throughout the Roman year. One of the most significant was the Vestalia in June, a festival honoring Vesta, during which married women were allowed to enter the temple of Vesta, normally forbidden to them to make offerings. The Vestals were, of course, at the heart of all the activities during this period. Their presence and participation legitimized these important public rites, linking the everyday life of Roman families represented by Vesta, goddess of the hearth, with the formal state religion. You also have duties related to the sacra, the sacred objects kept hidden within the temple of Vesta. While we'll talk more about those later, some daily or regular rituals likely involved tending to these objects or performing rites in their presence. These would be moments of intense sanctity, access granted only to the initiated Vestals. The air in that inner sanctuary would feel different, heavier with ancient mystery and power. A quirky tidbit about their prayers is that they often involved specific, formalized hand gestures or body postures that were part of the ritual tradition. It wasn't just about saying the words, it was a full physical performance, each movement freighted with meaning. Think of it like learning a sacred form of sign language that only other initiated people would understand. These specific ritual acts added another layer of complexity to their already demanding training. Historians still argue about the exact extent of the Vestal's involvement in state rituals outside the cult of Vesta herself. Were they primarily focused on their own goddess? Or did they act as general priestesses for the Roman state, lending their sacred status to a wider range of public ceremonies? It's one of those areas where the ancient texts give us tantalizing glimpses, but not a complete picture. We know they were important figures at public festivals, but the specifics of their year-round ritual calendar, beyond the daily duties and the Vestalia, remained somewhat debated. So, your days aren't just a passive watch over the fire. They are structured by ritual, marked by prayer, filled with the responsibility of performing ancient ceremonies correctly. You move between the sacred hearth, the altars within the atrium, and potentially out into the public spaces of the forum during festivals. Each act, no matter how small, is performed with the knowledge that you are acting on behalf of Rome, maintaining the delicate balance between the human world and the divine. It's a life of constant religious engagement, where every moment feels potentially charged with sacred meaning. You spend your days learning, praying, and keeping that crucial flame alive, all while living in the comfortable sacred confines of the Atrium Vestae. But the Temple of Vesta isn't just a place for a fire and some daily prayers. It also houses something else, something even more mysterious and, according to Roman belief, just as vital for the survival of the state as the eternal flame itself. Deep within the temple, in a hidden chamber known as the Pinus Vestae, are stored the Pignora Imperii, the sacred pledges or guarantees of the empire. These were not just valuable treasures in a monetary sense, but objects believed to hold immense religious and symbolic power, intrinsically linked to Rome's destiny. Their presence was thought to ensure the city's continued existence and prosperity. Think of them as ancient Horcruxes, but instead of holding a Dark Lord's soul, they held the very essence of Rome's longevity. And you, as a Vestal, are one of the few mortals allowed access to this inner sanctum, one of the guardians of these profound secrets. What exactly were the Pignora Imperii? Well, that's part of the mystery. They were deliberately kept secret from the general populace. The most famous item believed to be among them was the Palladium, a wooden statue of the goddess Pallas Athena Minerva to the Romans, said to have been brought to Italy by Aeneas himself after the fall of Troy. Roman legend connected their city's origins directly to Troy, and Aeneas was their foundational hero. Possessing the Palladium was seen as a tangible link to this glorious, divinely ordained past and a guarantee of future success. Beyond the Palladium, the contents of the Pinus Vestae are less clear. Ancient sources vaguely refer to other sacred things or archaic relics. These might have been objects linked to the early kings of Rome, or other sacred artifacts whose meaning had been lost to time but whose power was still revered. The secrecy surrounding them wasn't just for show. It was believed that revealing the Pignora to the uninitiated, or allowing them to fall into the wrong hands, would spell doom for Rome. So, your knowledge of what was actually in that chamber was a closely guarded secret, something you probably couldn't even whisper about to your family, even if you were allowed to see them. Your responsibility for these objects isn't explicitly detailed in our surviving sources, in the same way that tending the fire is. But it's implied that the Vestals were their primary caretakers. This likely involved periodic rituals performed in their presence, perhaps cleaning the chamber, ensuring their security, or making offerings nearby. Access to the Pinus was likely restricted even among the Vestals themselves, perhaps only the older or chief Vestal entering on specific occasions. Imagine being granted access to this super-secret vault. The air is probably thick with the scent of age and sanctity. The objects themselves mundane-looking or perhaps glowing with unseen power. And you know that what you are seeing are the literal anchors holding Rome to its greatness. Kind of puts guarding your grandma's antique vase into perspective, doesn't it? A mainstream historical fact is that the Romans believed the safety and continuation of their empire were tied to the preservation of certain sacred objects housed in the Temple of Vesta, known collectively as the Pignora Imperii, the most famous of which was the legendary Palladium. This belief was deeply ingrained in Roman state religion. A quirky tidbit: when the Gauls sacked Rome in 390 BC, the Vestals famously fled the city, taking the Pignora with them to the Etruscan town of Caere for safekeeping. This event is cited as proof of how seriously the Romans took the preservation of these objects. prioritizing their safety even over their own lives and the city's immediate defense. It's like the ultimate grab the essentials moment during a crisis. But the essentials are mysterious ancient relics. Historians still argue about the exact nature and number of the Pignora Imperii kept in the Pinus Vestae. Were there always the same items? Or did they change over time? Were they genuinely ancient artifacts or symbolic representations? How often did the Vestals interact with them? And what specific rituals were performed in their presence? These details are tantalizingly out of reach, lost to the secrecy that surrounded the cult. Your role as a guardian of these secrets adds another layer to your unique status. You are not just tending a fire, you are safeguarding the very symbols of Rome's divine mandate and historical legitimacy. It's a heavy burden, the weight of empire resting, in part, within that hidden chamber, under your protection. The quiet stone walls of the temple hold these profound mysteries, and you, the chosen Vestal, are among the privileged few who glimpse them. Life within the Atrium Vestae is largely contained, centered around the hearth, the hidden penis, and the rhythm of daily prayers. But not all your duties keep you behind those sacred walls. There's one particular task that regularly requires you to step outside the precinct, back into the bustling, sometimes overwhelming, world of Rome, the gathering of sacred water. You see, for many of the rituals performed by the Vestals, ordinary water from the city's public fountains or aqueducts simply wouldn't do. And water from the Tiber River absolutely forbidden for sacred use, far too polluted with the mundane activities and probably actual garbage of a major city. For the purification rites, for cleaning the temple, for various ceremonies, you needed aqua pura, pure spring water, ideally gathered directly from a source that hadn't passed through the lead pipes or public cisterns of Rome. The source most strongly associated with the Vestal's sacred water was the Aqua Appia, Rome's very first aqueduct, built way back in the 4th century BC. Its source was a spring outside the city. So, one of your regular duties, especially when you were one of the younger Vestals still in your training or early service years, involved a trip to a designated spot associated with this aqueduct or another pure spring source. It was like having a very specific, very ancient well you had to go to. Imagine the scene you put on your distinctive Vestal attire, the stola, the senicrines. Grab your vessel and step out of the quiet of the Forum precinct onto the noisy streets of Rome. People would notice you. This young woman in sacred dress, walking with purpose. You might need an escort, though historical sources aren't entirely clear on whether Vestals always traveled with guards for this specific task. You walk through the city, past shops, crowds, the everyday sights and smells of Roman life, heading towards the edge of the urban area, towards the source of the pure water. The vessels you carried were quite unique. They were called fuddles, earthenware jars that were not fired in a kiln, because they were unbaked. They were porous, you might think. Okay, why would you carry water in a pot that leaks? This wasn't about efficient transport or storage. The porosity of the futtiles was deliberate. It meant the water collected was truly ephemeral, intended only for immediate ritual use. You filled the jar at the spring and carried it back to the temple or house, knowing that the water would gradually seep out. It emphasized that this water wasn't for drinking or bathing. It was for sacred purposes, used and then gone. It's like using a sieve to carry juice. It sounds impractical, is utterly deliberate for symbolic reasons. Getting to the source, filling the fuddles, and carrying the heavy. Leaking jars back to the Atrium Vestae was a physical task. It might have been delegated to the younger Vestals, those undergoing their first 10 years of service. It wasn't exactly glamorous, but it was a necessary part of maintaining ritual purity. The water itself, gathered from a natural spring untouched by the city's infrastructure, mirrored the desired purity of the Vestals and the rituals they performed. Unpolluted water for unpolluted rites, performed by unpolluted priestesses. The symbolism was clear. Historians still argue about the exact source or sources used by the Vestals for aqua pura throughout Roman history. Did they always use a spring associated with the aqua appia? Or did the source change over time? And was this a daily chore? Or was water fetched only when specific rituals requiring it were scheduled? The frequency and exact location remain subjects of scholarly debate. A mainstream historical fact is that the Vestal virgins were required to use pure spring water, aqua pura drawn from a source like the aqua appia for their sacred duties. And this water had to be carried by the Vestals themselves in specific porous jars called futiles. This highlights the meticulous requirements of Roman religious practice. A quirky tidbit is the very nature of those fuddles. The fact that they were unbaked and leaked emphasizes that the act of fetching the water and its immediate ritual use was more important than its storage or transport efficiency. It's the journey and the purity at the moment of collection and use that mattered. Imagine explaining that job requirement today. Okay, so your main task is to collect this special liquid using a container specifically designed to lose the liquid on the way back. Why ritual purity? Right, where do I sign up? So, while much of your life is within the sacred precinct, there are moments when duty calls you outside, walking through the streets of Rome, carrying your porous water jar. You are a visible symbol of the city's connection to the divine, performing a simple yet profoundly symbolic task that ensures the purity of Rome's most ancient rites. It's a brief interaction with the world you've largely left behind, a reminder of the city whose fate is tied to your sacred service. You've journeyed outside the sacred precinct, carefully carrying your porous fuddles filled with pure spring water. This water isn't just for cleaning, it's a vital ingredient in another of your unique duties, the preparation of the mola salsa. Sounds like a spicy dip. Right, wrong. Mola salsa was actually a sacred mixture of roasted grain and salt, absolutely essential for countless Roman religious ceremonies, particularly sacrifices, and the only women in Rome entrusted with making the state's mola salsa. You guessed it, the Vestal virgins. This wasn't just baking, it was a profoundly ritualistic act. The purity of the mola salsa was paramount, as it would be used to purify and consecrate offerings made to the gods. Since the Vestals themselves embodied purity, they were the only ones deemed ritually clean enough to handle the ingredients and perform the preparation. It's like having the divine catering contract for all major state events, and the main dish is holy flour and salt. The ingredients were simple but specific. You needed grain, typically spelt or wheat, which was first roasted. You also needed salt, but not just any salt. It had to be purified, often by dissolving sea salt in that aqua pura you just fetched and letting it recrystallize. This process of purification removed any potential contamination or ritual impurity, ensuring the salt was as pure as the water and the Vestals themselves. Imagine spending time dissolving salt in water and waiting for it to evaporate again. A task that sounds tedious but is imbued with sacred purpose. Once the grain was roasted and the salt purified, you would grind the grain, perhaps using simple stone hand mills within the atrium vestae. You'd mix the resulting meal with the purified salt. The consistency was likely coarse, more like a meal or a crumbly mixture than a fine flour. This preparation wasn't done constantly, but at specific ritually significant times throughout the year, most notably for the festival of the Vestalia in June, and probably on the Calend, the first day of each month, when important state sacrifices often took place. The purpose of the mola salsa was to consecrate offerings. Before a sacrificial animal was killed, a pinch of mola salsa would be sprinkled on its head immolatio, which is where the word immolate comes from. It was also cast into the sacrificial fire on the altar or sprinkled on other offerings like cakes or fruits. This act made the offering acceptable to the deity. It was the sacred seal of approval, applied by this simple mixture prepared by the pure hands of the Vestals. A mainstream historical fact is that the preparation of the mola salsa was a specific and important duty reserved solely for the Vestal virgins, highlighting their unique ritual status and their role in ensuring the purity of state sacrifices. This monopoly on such a fundamental ritual element speaks volumes about their religious authority. A quirky tidbit is that the process of purifying the salt with aqua pura and then drying it was sometimes referred to as making muria pura pure brine, from which the purified salt was obtained. It shows the level of detail and ritual required even for something as common as salt when it was intended for sacred use. They weren't just grabbing the shaker off the table. Historians still argue about the exact recipe and ritual for preparing the mola salsa in different periods of Roman history. Did the type of grain always stay the same? What were the precise prayers or actions performed during the mixing? And was mola salsa exclusively used in state cults? Or did its use, or a version of it, extend into private family religious practices? Perhaps made at home using Vestal prepared salt? It's one of those ancient culinary mysteries. So, beyond tending the fire and performing public rites, your duties include these quieter, more domestic-seeming tasks that are nonetheless charged with profound religious significance. Grinding the grain, purifying the salt, mixing them together. Each step is a deliberate act of preparation, ensuring that when the time comes for Rome's priests and magistrates to make their offerings, the mola salsa, prepared by your ritually pure hands, will make those offerings acceptable to the watchful gods. It's baking for the divine, with the safety of the state on the line. No pressure to get the proportions right. Living within the atrium vestae, surrounded by ancient rituals and sacred silence, it might feel like you're entirely cut off from the rest of Rome. And in many ways, you are. Your home is a sanctuary, deliberately set apart. But your role isn't solely confined to tending a fire and whispering prayers within sacred walls. As a Vestal Virgin, you are also a public figure, a living symbol of Rome's connection to the divine. And this status brings you into contact with the outside world, albeit in specific and highly controlled ways. You don't just wander down to the local shops for snacks or hang out at the baths for gossip. Your interactions are purposeful, often tied to your religious duties or the unique privileges your sacred status affords you. When you do leave the atrium vestae, perhaps to fetch that sacred water, participate in a public festival procession, attend public games, or perform a ritual elsewhere in the city, you do so with a degree of ceremony and respect that is striking. Imagine walking through the forum or down a busy street. People notice you immediately, dressed in your distinctive white stola and veiled head, and they don't just glance, they stop. They might fall silent, step aside, or even make way for you. It was customary for passersby to show reverence to a Vestal Virgin. You might even be accompanied by a lictor, one of the attendants who usually precede high-ranking magistrates, clearing their path and symbolizing their authority. Having a guy with fasces a bundle of rods, sometimes with an axe, symbolizing power walking in front of you, telling people to move, is a pretty clear sign you're kind of a big deal. It's the ancient Roman equivalent of having a VIP escort wherever you go. Your sacred status gives you a level of respect and immunity that no other woman in Rome possesses. And few men, you could travel through the city unescorted by a male guardian, a significant freedom in a society where most respectable women were expected to be accompanied. Your person was considered inviolable. To harm a Vestal, or even insult her, was a grave offense against the state and the goddess herself, punishable by death. You are literally untouchable in a society that otherwise exerted considerable control over its female citizens. You interact with powerful figures regularly. The Pontifex Maximus is your direct superior, so meetings with him would be necessary for administrative matters, disciplinary issues, or consultations on religious protocol. Magistrates and senators involved in state religious affairs would also interact with the Vestals during public ceremonies. Sometimes, powerful individuals would seek you out for specific purposes. A mainstream historical fact is that Vestal virgins possessed the unique legal right to witness private wills and important state treaties. In a time when documents needed reliable, trustworthy witnesses, the absolute purity and sanctity of a Vestal made her testimony unimpeachable. If a senator or even an emperor wanted to ensure their will would be honored, or a treaty considered binding, having a Vestal witness, it was the ultimate guarantee. It's like having a notary public whose honesty is divinely guaranteed. You might also interact with members of the public who sought your help or intercession. Your sacred status was believed to give your words weight with the gods. There are accounts, possibly semi-legendary, of Vestals using their authority to intervene in legal matters or even commute death sentences. A famous, though debated tradition claimed that if a Vestal accidentally encountered a condemned criminal being led to execution, that criminal was automatically pardoned. Think about that you're just minding your own business, fetching water, and boom. You save someone's life just by being in the right or wrong place at the right time. Talk about accidental superpower activation. A quirky tidbit is the seating arrangement at public games or events. While most Roman women were relegated to less prominent seats, Vestals were often granted prime seating, typically in a place of honor near the magistrates. Their presence at these public spectacles wasn't just for their enjoyment, it was a visible affirmation of the state's religious foundations, a reminder that even in moments of leisure, the gods and their priestesses were present, getting the best seats in the house just for having a specific job. Not a bad perk? Historians still argue about the frequency and true nature of their interactions with private citizens versus state officials. How often did people seek their help? How much genuine influence did a Vestal have beyond their prescribed religious duties? Particularly the younger Vestals. And were these public appearances and interactions always welcomed by the Vestals themselves? Or were they sometimes seen as a burden or a potential risk to their purity? The extent of their personal agency in these public moments is a subject of scholarly debate. So, while your home is secluded, your role connects you to the heart of Roman power and public life in unique ways. You walk among the people, command respect simply by your presence, and hold a silent authority that can influence matters of state and even life and death. It's a strange blend of isolation and public reverence. A life lived within sacred walls but with significant, albeit controlled, glimpses of the world outside. As you navigate the balance between your secluded sacred duties and those occasional high-profile interactions with the outside world, you start to fully grasp the other side of the coin, the immense privileges that come with being a Vestal virgin. You aren't just a temple employee, you are a member of an elite, state-sponsored priesthood, and your sacred status grants you advantages that are almost unheard of for women in Roman society. Let's be clear, in ancient Rome, most women, regardless of their social class, lived under the legal authority of a male guardian, their father, husband, or appointed tutor. This guardian controlled their property, managed their legal affairs, and generally held power over major decisions in their lives. But not you. As a Vestal virgin, you are legally independent. From the moment you are capta and enter the atrium vesti, you are freed from paternal authority. You do not require a male guardian. You can conduct legal business, manage your own affairs, and even make your own will, something many Roman women couldn't do without their guardian's consent. This legal autonomy is a massive perk, granting you a level of personal freedom and control that is astonishing for a woman of this era. It's like having the legal standing of an adult man, simply because you dedicated your life to Vesta and promised to stay single. Then there's the money. Vestals received a state stipend, essentially a salary from the Roman treasury, acknowledging their role as servants of the state religion. But more than that, they could receive gifts and donations from wealthy individuals and even emperors. They managed their own finances, accumulating considerable personal wealth over their 30 years of service. They could own property, enslaved people, and other assets, controlling their own economic destiny. Imagine being in charge of your own substantial fortune in a time when most women's wealth was technically managed by a man. This financial independence gave Vestals significant practical power and security, especially when they retired. This combination of legal and financial independence translated into influence. While Vestals didn't hold political office, that world was exclusively male, their sacred status gave them a unique moral authority. They had access to the highest levels of Roman society, dining with emperors, consulting with senators, and their opinions on religious matters, or even broader moral issues would carry weight. Think of the Virgo Maxima as having the ear of the most powerful men in Rome, not through political maneuvering, but through sheer, unassailable sanctity. We've already touched on the public respect, but it bears repeating as a fundamental privilege. The lictors clearing your path, the automatic deference shown by crowds, the preferential seating at public events like the games or theater, these weren't just nice gestures. They were formal acknowledgments of your sacred status, concrete symbols of the respect and protection afforded to you by the state and by society. You could ride in a carriage within the city walls, a privilege usually restricted to certain male officials and forbidden to other women who had to walk or be carried in litters. It's like having your own designated driver and guaranteed clear roads. A mainstream historical fact is that Vestal virgins were unique among Roman women in possessing full legal and financial independence, free from the requirement of male guardianship that applied to their female contemporaries. This set them apart as women of significant autonomy within a patriarchal legal system. A quirky tidbit, this legal independence meant that Vestals could and did free enslaved people. Manumitting slaves was often a complex legal process requiring a male citizen. A Vestal, acting on her own authority, could perform this act, another tangible demonstration of her unusual legal power and control over her own household and property. Historians still argue about the extent to which Vestals actively used their financial independence and political access to exert influence beyond purely religious matters. Did they lobby for particular policies? Did they use their wealth to support causes or individuals? How much did their influence vary depending on the personality of the individual? Vestal or the political climate of the time? The precise boundaries of their informal power and how they wielded it remain subjects of scholarly debate. So, while the vows are strict and the duties are demanding, the life of a Vestal comes with significant advantages. You live in comfort, manage your own wealth, possess a level of legal autonomy unmatched by other Roman women, and command public respect bordering on veneration. Your sacred status is a shield, a key to influence, and a source of personal power in a world where women generally had very little of it. It's a complex package of sacrifice and privilege, isolation and influence. So, we've seen the gilded cage, the shining privileges that come with your sacred status, legal independence, financial control, public reverence, access to power. Pretty sweet deal for a woman in ancient Rome. Right? Well, every gilded cage still has bars, and the bars on the Vestal cage are incredibly strong and unforgiving. Your life is one of immense privilege. Yes, but it is also one of severe restrictions, constant scrutiny, and an absolute terrifying lack of privacy, both physical and personal. The most fundamental restriction, the vow that defines you as a Vestal virgin, is the commitment to absolute chastity for the entire 30 years of your service. This isn't just a suggestion, it's the core requirement of your role. Vesta herself is a virgin goddess, representing the purity of the hearth and, by extension, the purity of Rome. You, as her priestess, must embody that purity. This means no romantic relationships, no marriage, and absolutely no sexual activity for 3 decades. This vow is so central that breaking it carries the most severe punishment imaginable. Something we'll explore in chilling detail later. It's the ultimate deal breaker. You fail this one, and everything else goes spectacularly wrong. Beyond the absolute requirement for chastity, your daily life is governed by strict rules. Your appearance is rigidly controlled. You wear the distinctive plain white stola, the long woolen dress of the Vestal, and you must always wear the senicrines. The traditional Vestal hairstyle consisting of 6 braids. This hairstyle, strangely, resembles that of a Roman bride, a peculiar symbol for someone vowed to lifelong, 30-year celibacy. It's like wearing a permanent bridal veil, a constant visual reminder of a life path you are deliberately not taking. This specific dress and hairstyle instantly mark you out, ensuring you are always recognizable as a Vestal. There's no blending in, no casual Fridays. Your uniform is your identity, and it broadcasts your sacred status and your restrictions to everyone you encounter. Your movements outside the atrium vestae are also limited. While you have permission to go out for specific religious duties like fetching water or attending state functions, you can't just wander around Rome freely for leisure. When you are out, you are typically accompanied, even if only by lictors clearing the way, and you are expected to maintain a demeanor appropriate to your sacred office. Spontaneous pub crawls or shopping sprees, not in your 30-year plan. Interaction with men is particularly scrutinized. While you interact with powerful male officials due to your duties, private or casual interactions with men are heavily restricted to protect your purity and avoid any suspicion. You are under constant observation, not just by the other Vestals in the Virgo Maxima, but by the Roman public. Everyone knows who you are, what you represent, and the gravity of your vows. Any hint of impropriety, any whisper of a rumor, can trigger an investigation by the Pontifex Maximus and a council of priests. Your life is not truly your own. It is a public trust, a symbol that must remain unsullied for the good of the state. It's like living in a fishbowl made of crystal, and everyone outside has a magnifying glass. A mainstream historical fact is that the Vestal virgins were bound by a solemn vow of chastity for the entirety of their 30 years of service, a requirement directly linked to the ritual purity required by the goddess Vesta and the state religion. A quirky tidbit related to the restrictions: there were specific rules about riding in carriages within the city. While Vestals were granted the privilege of riding in carriages, whereas most other women were forbidden unless elderly or ill. This was itself a regulated activity. Another example of how their freedoms were often tied to specific, sanctioned contexts rather than general liberty. Even your mode of transport is a symbol. Historians still argue about the day-to-day practical enforcement of these restrictions, especially concerning interactions with family or close male relatives. How isolated were they truly? Did the level of strictness vary depending on the era or the personality of the Virgo Maxima? And how much personal freedom or relaxation of the rules did Vestals manage to negotiate or simply take in practice? Away from the official gaze, the actual lived experience under this constant scrutiny is a subject of scholarly debate. So, while you hold immense status and unique freedoms compared to other Roman women, your life is also tightly controlled. The golden cage is real. You are bound by vows and rules that dictate your appearance, your movements, and your most intimate personal life. The price of your privilege is a life lived under the microscope, where the slightest perceived misstep can have catastrophic consequences, not just for you, but potentially for all of Rome. Your life is a delicate balance. Isn't it high status and privilege on one side, stringent rules and constant scrutiny on the other? And underlying it all is the knowledge that failure isn't just disappointing, it's catastrophic. The Romans believed that if a Vestal failed in her duties, particularly by violating her vow of chastity, it angered the goddess Vesta and could bring divine punishment upon the entire city. Your personal conduct, therefore, has national implications. The consequences of letting Vesta's wrath fall upon Rome are terrifyingly real, and the system had ways of dealing with Vestals who messed up, ranging from severe warnings to punishments that sound brutal to our modern ears. Letting the sacred fire go out. That core, non-negotiable duty we discussed is perhaps the most well-known lesser failure with immediate consequences. If the flame died, it was proof of negligence, of vidum, a religious flaw. The Vestal on duty responsible for the lapse faced punishment. What did that involve? Often, it was a flogging, a ritual beating administered by the Pontifex Maximus himself. Sometimes within the Atrium Vestae or near the Temple of Vesta. Imagine the most powerful religious figure in Rome, the guy who picked you for this job, personally administering corporal punishment. This wasn't just about physical pain, it was a ritual act intended to purify the Vestal and appease Vesta, a physical penance to restore the divine balance that had been upset. It's like getting a performance review that involves actual whipping. Your fire tending metrics are down. Claudia, this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. Maybe other lesser failures could also incur penalties. Mistakes in performing rituals, misremembering a prayer, fumbling a sacred object, getting the intricate steps wrong could also be considered vitium and require some form of atonement. While the sources aren't always clear on whether every minor slip-up led to a beating, any perceived lack of diligence or ritual impurity could trigger an investigation or a period of penance. Your life was expected to be one of constant, perfect observance. The Pontifex Maximus held the ultimate authority in judging the conduct of the Vestals. He could investigate accusations, conduct trials within the College of Pontiffs, and determine the appropriate punishment. These punishments were viewed not merely as secular penalties, but as necessary steps to correct a religious transgression and protect the state from divine retribution. Your body, your conduct, was a matter of state and divine concern. A mainstream historical fact is that ritual failures by Vestal virgins, such as allowing the sacred fire to be extinguished, were punished with severe measures, including ritual beatings administered by the Pontifex Maximus, as a means of purification and appeasing the gods. A quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest the Vestal would be led into a darkened corner or cubicle for the beating, a physical separation to emphasize the ritual purification taking place. It highlights the deliberate theatricality and symbolic nature of the punishment, turning the Vestal's body into a site of public religious correction. Historians still argue about the frequency with which these ritual punishments were actually carried out. Were they common occurrences, or were they rare events used as powerful examples? Did the severity of the beatings vary, and were all ritual errors treated equally? Or was there discretion in determining which required formal punishment? The actual lived experience of facing such penalties and how often it happened remains a subject of scholarly debate. These punishments, while severe, were for failures in the performance of duties or lapses in vigilance. There was one failure, however, but one breaking of the core vow that carried a penalty so extreme, so horrifying, it stood apart from all others. It wasn't just about ritual impurity. It was seen as a fundamental betrayal of Vesta, Rome, and your sacred oath. It was the consequence for breaking the vow of chastity, an offense known as incestum. These lesser penalties, the beatings and penances, are just a hint, a grim foreshadowing of the ultimate chilling fate that awaited a Vestal who violated her most sacred promise. We've talked about the immense privileges, the strict rules, and the ritual punishments for things like letting the fire flicker out. But there is one transgression, one failure of duty, so profound, so fundamentally opposed to everything a Vestal represents, that its punishment stands alone, a chilling testament to the stakes involved. That failure is the violation of your vow of chastity, an offense the Romans called incestum. This wasn't merely a moral failing, it was considered an act of sacrilege that polluted the Vestal, angered the goddess Vesta, and threatened to bring cosmic disaster upon the entire Roman state. And the penalty for this crime? It was arguably the most horrifying form of state execution devised by the Romans, being buried alive. If a Vestal was suspected of incestum, a formal investigation was launched, led by the Pontifex Maximus. This was not a quick or casual affair. Witnesses would be called, evidence presented, and the matter debated before a council of priests. While accounts vary on how often accusations were made or how many led to convictions, the process was designed to be thorough, reflecting the gravity of the charge. If found guilty, the sentence was swift and absolute. A Vestal's body was considered sacred, dedicated to Vesta. This sanctity meant her blood could not be spilled on Roman soil through conventional execution methods like beheading or strangling. Instead, a method was devised that was ritually clean, a non-bloody death that also symbolized her betrayal. She was to be returned, alive, to the earth she had in the eyes of Rome. Polluted, the execution was a solemn, terrifying ritual. Stripped of your sacred Vestal attire, the stola, the senicrines, and dressed perhaps in the clothes of a corpse, you would be placed in a covered litter, like a funeral procession, and carried out of the city walls. The destination was a specific spot known as the Campus Celeratus, the field of wickedness just outside the Colline Gate. This location was chosen because it was considered impious to bury anyone within the sacred boundary of the city, except for a very few exceptional cases. And this was a burial of the condemned, not a proper funeral. At the Campus Sceleratus, an underground chamber would have been prepared. It wasn't a spacious tomb, but a small, enclosed space. Inside, cruelly, they might place a few provisions, a small amount of bread, a jug of water, perhaps a lamp. This wasn't an act of mercy, it was a twisted formality, a way for the state to claim it wasn't technically starving or suffocating you directly, but merely placing you in a situation where death was inevitable, allowing Vesta or the Furies to claim you without direct state-sponsored bloodshed. It's a chilling example of Roman legal and religious casuistry. You are led down into this chamber. The air is cold. The darkness absolute except for the flicker of the small lamp. The taste of fear must be overwhelming. The reality of your fate closing in. Then, the chamber is sealed from above. Earth is piled on top, burying the entrance, returning the ground to a level surface. You are alone in the dark, with only the sound of your own breathing and the knowledge of what is to come. It is a slow, agonizing death, a termination of your sacred life that mirrored, in Roman belief, the extinguishing of your inner flame of purity. A mainstream historical fact is that the punishment for a Vestal virgin found guilty of incestum, breaking her vow of chastity, was immurement, or being buried alive, considered necessary because her sacred status forbade the shedding of her blood. A quirky tidbit. The man involved in the alleged incestum did not escape punishment. He was typically flogged to death in the Roman form, a public and bloody end that contrasted sharply with the ritually clean burial of the Vestal. It shows that while the Vestal status required a different form of execution, the alleged partner was also held accountable, albeit through a more conventional, though brutal state penalty. Historians still argue about how frequently these burials actually occurred throughout the 1,000-year history of the Vestal cult. Were accusations common, but convictions rare? Was the punishment a terrifying deterrent that was seldom carried out? Or did it happen more often than the surviving sources explicitly state? And what level of evidence was truly required for the Pontifex Maximus and Council to condemn a Vestal to such a fate? The frequency of these tragic events and the specifics of the conviction process remain subjects of scholarly debate. The prospect of this fate hung over every Vestal, a dark shadow cast by the brilliant light of their privilege and sanctity. It was the ultimate terrible price for failing to uphold the purity that was the foundation of their power and the guarantor of Rome's favor with the gods. Being buried alive wasn't just a punishment, it was a ritual undoing, a terrifying return to the earth for a life deemed too polluted to continue among the living. We've cast a long shadow over the possibility of failure, the terrifying consequences of incestum or even lesser ritual slips. But the story of a Vestal virgin doesn't have to end in tragedy. For many, perhaps even most, the 30 years of dedicated service were completed successfully. You make it through the decade of learning, the decade of active service, and the decade of teaching the next generation. 30 years of tending the flame, performing the rites, guarding the secrets, living under scrutiny, maintaining your purity, and then it's over. At around age 36 to 40, depending on when you were taken, you have fulfilled your sacred contract with Vesta and with Rome. You are no longer bound by your vows of service or chastity. This is a moment of profound transition. After living in the atrium vesti from childhood, your time there is complete. You are free to leave the priesthood and re-enter Roman society. It's like graduating from the most intense, longest boarding school ever. Except now you're middle-aged and potentially one of the wealthiest, most respected women in Rome. What do you do with this newfound freedom? For some, perhaps returning to their original family was an option, assuming family members were still alive and willing to take you in. But after 30 years, your parents might be gone. Your siblings might have their own households, and you might feel like a stranger in your childhood home. The more common and often desired path for a retiring Vestal was marriage. Yes, that vow of chastity that defined your life for 3 decades is lifted. You are now free to marry, and far from being seen as damaged goods after 30 years of celibacy. Former Vestals were considered highly desirable brides. Why? Several reasons. You came with significant wealth, having accumulated your stipends, gifts, and managing your own property for years. You also retained the legal independence you gained upon becoming a Vestal. You did not revert to being under male guardianship. This made you a valuable partner, not someone whose assets and decisions needed managing. Perhaps even more importantly in the Roman mindset, marrying a former Vestal was considered incredibly lucky. Their 30 years of dedicated service and accumulated purity were believed to bring good fortune to their husband and his family. Imagine telling your friends you're marrying someone who literally spent their life ensuring Rome didn't get smited by gods. Sounds like a pretty good investment in your future, right? As a result, former Vestals often married prominent senators, generals, or wealthy citizens, joining the highest ranks of Roman aristocratic families. However, re-entering society and adjusting to married life after 30 years in a strictly controlled, all-female environment must have presented significant challenges. You've been living by a rigid schedule, your interactions with men have been formal and limited, and you're likely out of touch with the social norms and complexities of managing a large Roman household, since staff did most of the work at the atrium vesti. Imagine suddenly being expected to host dinner parties, navigate marital dynamics, and possibly raise children after decades of living a life defined by ritual purity and independence. It's like trying to relearn how to ride a bike. But the bike is now a chariot and you're expected to win a race immediately. A mainstream historical fact is that upon completing their 30-year term, Vestal virgins were honorably discharged from service and were legally free to marry, often becoming sought-after wives for prominent Roman men. A quirky tidbit. While marriage was the common path, not all retiring Vestals chose it. Some may have preferred to live independently, enjoying their wealth and legal freedom without taking on the responsibilities of marriage and family life. They were not compelled to marry, only permitted to do so. Historians still argue about how frequently retiring Vestals actually married and whether these marriages were generally happy or successful. Was the adjustment too difficult for many? Did the independence and wealth they brought cause friction in their marriages? And how well did they truly reintegrate into the complex web of Roman social life after such a long period of isolation and unique status? The realities of their retirement and social reentry are subjects of scholarly debate. So, after 3 decades of unique service, the possibility of regaining a more normal life, complete with marriage and family, is available. It's a path few women in Rome could take, one that combines the respect and wealth earned through sacred duty with the potential for personal connection outside the sacred precinct. It's freedom. Yes, but freedom that comes after a lifetime shaped by the rigorous demands of Vesta. You've made it through 30 years. You've tended the sacred fire, learned the ancient prayers, guarded the mysterious Pignora Imperii, fetched pure water, prepared the mola salsa, navigated the strange mix of seclusion and public life, enjoyed the privileges, endured the restrictions, and avoided the terrifying consequences of failure. You are now free, a former Vestal virgin, carrying with you the weight of decades of sacred service, the accumulated wealth, the legal independence, and the indelible mark of having lived a life like no other in Rome. But what is the lasting impact of the Vestal Virgins themselves? What is their legacy in the long, unfolding story of the Roman world? For over 1,000 years, from the semi-legendary founding of Rome down to the late 4th century AD, the Vestal Virgins were a constant presence at the heart of the city's religious life. Their cult was one of the most ancient and enduring institutions of Rome. This longevity alone speaks volumes about their perceived importance. They were seen not just as priestesses, but as living embodiments of Roman continuity, purity, and piety. As long as the Vestals served and the fire burned, Rome was safe. Their influence extended beyond purely religious duties. Their legal independence and financial autonomy gave them a practical standing rare for Roman women. They could manage property, make wills, and their presence as witnesses on important documents was considered inviolable. This legal power, combined with their moral authority derived from their sacred status, meant they could exert informal influence in the political sphere. While they didn't vote or hold office, their opinions mattered to the men who did. Dining with emperors, consulting with pontiffs, interceding on behalf of others, these interactions demonstrate a quiet power wielded from within their sacred sphere. They were also powerful symbols in Roman society. To the average Roman, the sight of a Vestal in her distinctive dress walking through the forum was a tangible connection to the divine, a reminder of the god's favor or potential displeasure. They were objects of reverence, sometimes awe and perhaps sometimes fear, given the severe penalties associated with their cult. They represented an ideal of Roman virtue, disciplined, dedicated, pure, even if that ideal was largely unattainable for most people. A mainstream historical fact is that the cult of the Vestal Virgins endured for over 10 centuries. From Rome's legendary beginnings until its abolition around 391 AD by the Christian emperor Theodosius the Martyr as part of the measures against paganism. The extinguishing of the sacred fire of Vesta after over a millennium was a symbolic moment marking the end of an era in Roman religion. The end of the Vestal cult came not from internal failure, but from external religious and political change. As Christianity rose to become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, the ancient state cults were suppressed. Theodosius's decree effectively disbanded the Vestals, extinguished the sacred fire permanently, and confiscated their property. The Atrium Vestae, the house you called home for 30 years that was later repurposed, eventually falling into ruin. A quirky tidbit is that even after the abolition of the cult and the extinguishing of the fire, the Atrium Vestae wasn't immediately demolished. For a time, it seems to have been used for administrative purposes, or perhaps even as residences, before eventually crumbling over the centuries. Its statues toppled, its sacred hearth cold. The echoes of its former inhabitants faded slowly. Historians still argue about the actual level of informal influence Vestals had on Roman politics throughout different periods. Was it consistent? Or did it ebb and flow depending on the political climate and the personalities of the chief Vestal and the emperors? How much did the public perception and role of the Vestals evolve over their 1,000-year history? And to what extent should we see them primarily as religious figures, or also as powerful, albeit uniquely constrained? Women in Roman society. Their complex place in history remains a subject of scholarly debate. So, the Vestal Virgins left a significant mark on Rome. They were guardians of its religious heart, symbols of its continuity, and women who carved out a unique space of power and independence within a patriarchal world. Their story is a window into the intricate relationship between religion, state, gender, and power in one of the most influential civilizations in history. They ensured the flame burned bright for 1,000 years, and their legacy continues to flicker in the historical record. Word count 1090. As the story of the Vestal Virgins draws to a close, you can feel the ancient city quietening down once more. The crackle of the sacred fire, the murmur of ancient prayers, the echo of footsteps in the Atrium Vestae. Let those sounds gently fade into the quiet space of your own room. The burden of tending the flame, guarding the secrets, navigating the complex rules and privileges. It all softens now, becoming just a chapter in the long history of the world. Your own breath is slow and steady. The only sound, the gentle hum of the fan, anchoring you firmly in the present moment. There's no ancient flame to tend tonight, no solemn vows to remember, just the comforting weight of your blanket. Allow the details of their unique lives, the sacrifices and the strange freedoms, to drift away like smoke from a long extinguished fire. You are here, safe and sound, a world away from the marble city and its dedicated priestesses. Feel yourself settling deeper, releasing any lingering thoughts, just allowing the quiet to welcome you. End of script. Sweet dreams.